Hello everyone. Today we're going to be doing some environment painting or concept art. I'm going to do 3 of them today. So I've got my page split up into thirds, and what I'm going to do is paint up 3 different environment concepts in each. So the way that I start out is I'll put in a base color for the environment. In this first one I went and chose a very kind of slimy yellow wash for the color. Then I put down a bit of a color palette based on that, and I just start sketching away. Now, the primary thing that I try to concentrate on in the beginning phase of a piece of concept art is usually the composition. Not just that, but also the color scheme that I might want to go for, the feeling, the overall look of the painting, and how I want it to eventually end up. Okay, so what I'm mainly focusing on is putting down a really good base to begin with, and then slowly building that up into something which looks a little bit more finished. But I will be constantly building on that initial base that I lay down in this beginning phase, which, by the way, if each painting takes about an hour to do, this beginning phase will maybe take about 15 minutes. And that's just sketching in key elements of the painting, such as the point of attention, setting down the foreground, midground, and background, which are all separated using environmental fog, which I create with the airbrush, usually using the ambient light color, which in this case is a light cyan blue. And once I've got that initial base down, I begin to start literally sketching in the details. Now I know it's going to work out for me in the long run because I made sure that the base was correct to begin with. The other thing about starting out with an environment painting is you want to work from a distance. You want to work zoomed out a little bit, and even at the stage where I'm starting to put in the details, you can see that I'm still keeping my distance as I work. And the reason for that is it gives you an overall view of how the painting is being structured, how it's looking. Rather than just focusing on one little area of detail in the painting, I can see what it looks like as a whole. And that's very, very important when it comes to environments, especially because they need to work as a whole. So literally, to get those details in, all I'm doing is I've shrunk my brush down to a smaller size, and I start to literally just sketch in the details. You can see that I'm still breaking up the foreground elements and the midground elements by dropping in some environmental fog every time I want to separate some values, and that will create an illusion of depth within the painting. Now, concerning depth within a painting, usually the foreground is going to be more darker in value than the midground and background, getting lighter as the picture goes back into the distance. That's something that you want to definitely keep in mind and use to your advantage to create that illusion of depth, because sometimes it's very hard to get that when you're working on a 2D kind of platform. Another thing you want to think about is your color palette and the color scheme that you want to work with for a particular painting. You want to create interest and contrast within the work by using contrasting colors which also go together well. And the best way you can find that out in regards to what colors go well and what colors don't necessarily suit one another is jump onto Google or grab a book which goes through color theory and you'll be able to find an example of the color wheel. Just look it up in Google, color wheel, and read about how the colors on that wheel actually fit together in a way that complements one another. Now you could keep it all cool colors or all warm colors. You could keep it all different variations of the one color, but what you tend to get there is a image which lacks interest, and which lacks that extra bit of depth in terms of visual appeal. So obviously I've chosen, in terms of pointing out what contrasting colors are in this first environment painting that I'm working on, obviously the reddy, yellow, orange mushrooms that I've put into the painting stand out, and I think as a viewer that's where the eye is going to stop at. It gives areas of the painting that kind of ability to let the viewer's eye have a rest on certain points within the picture, and that is very important. You know, it helps it to break it up a little bit rather than just blending in all into the one kind of image. So you want to create visual interest and visual appeal at the end of the day. It's something which is very important to incorporate into your work, and we do that through variation and contrast of color and value within a painting. So see me adding in some bounce lighting there, so it's giving the illusion that there is in fact actual luminescent light coming off of those mushrooms. They're truly giving off light. So I've tried to emulate that by having a bit of orange bounce light coming up onto the rocks surrounding those mushrooms. And again, I've got quite a small sized brush there, and I'm just sketching in the details as if I would a pencil drawing or a sketch. Of course, using different variations of color to get the effect and look that I want, but nonetheless it's still very much just sketching in the details. So in the beginning phase of a painting, when you're first getting down the structure of your image, what you want to think about doing is actually using a larger brush to paint in those big shapes and those main details to ensure that the composition is correct and that it's going to in fact work. I have a main color palette, but at the same time it gets to a point where I stop adding in new colors and I simply just keep on using colors which are already in the painting by color picking them. So to get up your color picker on the fly, just hold down Alt. That will turn your brush to the color picker or the eyedrop tool, and just select the area of the painting where you want to sample the color, and it will select that color for you and you'll be able to use it. So for a majority of this painting, that's in fact what I've done, as well as of course adjusting the hue, saturation and brightness over to the right hand side there. After I'm happy with the painting, I will use some adjustment layers to actually get different variations of hue and contrast, and just to tweak it up a little bit. So jumping into the second painting here, I'm going to use a different technique with a few variations of the different brushes that you might be able to use. Now, it really doesn't matter what brush you use, you can still get the same effect. It doesn't matter how you start out. You can start out with a sketch, you can start out with a painting, you can start out with random shapes and blobs of color like I'm doing in this second image. It really doesn't matter, as long as you've got something to work from. because there's nothing worse than starting out with just a blank canvas and no idea about what direction you want to head in. The cool thing about this technique is that it lets you use your imagination a little bit more rather than getting caught up in the technical details and way of doing things, which can in turn, unfortunately, kill creativity. What this technique allows us to do is almost start searching for images in the clouds. The brain is in fact very good at recognizing patterns and images in chaos, which is why this technique is really good, because it allows you to make what many in the industry would call happy accidents. And that's where true originality comes from. So although you're starting out in chaos and with all these different variations of color and shapes, the technical side and the technical techniques that you know, those basic fundamentals, help to actually pull out an image from all of that and create something which you might not have even premeditated. It might simply, this is another really cool thing about working this way, is that sometimes as the artist you just don't know what you're going to get. You don't know what you're going to end up with, which can make it a whole lot more fun. Now, of course, if you're working for a studio or a freelance job with very high specs and a fairly thought out brief, you're not going to have as much control over what you can do with it. So it might not necessarily be able to be as random as this, but at the same time, maybe whoever you're working for, your client or whoever it may be, does want you to come up with something completely original, something really out of the water, in which case a technique such as this will allow you to do that. It will allow you to introduce that originality and that creativity without getting caught up in the details, which, as I said before, can really hinder the ability to use imagination and effectively. So, of course, working fast in the beginning, but also obviously putting a lot of thought into the composition and the way you want the painting to be laid out in general. The cool thing about working fast is that if I want to make a quick change or a big change, it really doesn't matter because it doesn't take long. I haven't put hours of work and detail into a particular area as of yet, so if I want to drop in a canyon in the middle of the painting that wasn't there before, I can easily do that, without having wasted too much time on something that I had to throw out simply because it wasn't working compositionally or for whatever reason it might be. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, because in the beginning it's not going to be perfect. Your painting may go through many iterations before you eventually reach something that you're happy with, and only then should you begin to put in details. Only then should you begin to flesh it out and refine it, because it's that initial stage which is the most important. So now, as I did with the top one, I'm starting to just literally drawing the details, using a smaller size brush to sketch in the different highlights and shadows. Of course, using my airbrush to create fog, which in turn will create depth in the image and help to separate the different foreground, midground and background elements. And in terms of what fog color you should be using, it really doesn't matter too much, as long as I usually use a color which is I mean, the best rule of thumb is to use a color which would be the same color as the ambient light or the environment light. And of course, simply all I'm doing here is using colors that I've already laid in, color picking them and maybe adjusting their brightness a little bit, maybe their saturation, but as far as adding in completely brand new colors, I will rarely do that at this stage. The rest of the image will be made up of colors which are already there. I think when you start out with a environment painting, what you're really doing is looking for shapes which are appealing, shapes which catch your eye. And that's why I find environments to be a bit more fun in terms of creativity in comparison to, say, character, for example, where things such as proportion and anatomy are a must, and they do need to be kept in mind from the very beginning. Gesture, pose, whatever it might be. The thing with environments is that you can basically have anything, and your imagination really is the limit. Of course, when you're designing something, no matter if it's a character or an environment or whatever it might be sure to use lots of reference material. I think everybody, if you're a concept artist, you should have your own reference library, which not only serves as reference material, but also serves as a source of inspiration and of motivation even. The other thing you want to obviously keep in mind in terms of fundamentals for environments is, and really this is the only one besides composition, you want to keep in mind your perspective, which is so important. If you don't understand or know perspective, then you're going to have a very hard time being able to draw anything. So study up on it. That's the first and foremost thing that you should be practicing and getting completely down. You should know it off by heart. It should come naturally to the point where you almost don't have to think about it. Start off by drawing cubes in perspective and other primitive shapes such as cylinders, spheres, cones, pyramids, whatever it might be, because at the end of the day, I think everything in the world really that we know of can be whittled down into these very primitive shapes. That's what the entire world is made up of. Buildings are just cubes, barrels are just cylinders, basketballs, worlds are just spheres, and that's it. A character's arm is just a cylinder. Character's head is just a sphere, and it is rendered and shaded accordingly as well. So perspective is mandatory if you want to be able to draw effectively and present something as if it's 3D and as if it's alive. But for environments, perspective is the one thing that you must know. And your composition, of course. Now, the other thing you want to keep in mind for composition as well is it's a good idea to have a focal point within your environment image, something that the viewer's eye stops on as soon as they look at the image, the first thing that their eye sees. In this case, it's the tower off into the distance that you see on the canvas in this second painting. And the reason it stands out, there's a number of things. But the main reason is that it's a dark value which has been placed on a lighter value behind it. So if you want to make something stand out, the most effective way of doing that is to have it against something else which is in high contrast to it. So if I were to have, for example, a black canvas and I put a white dot in the middle of that black canvas, what you'll find is that the first thing your eye will see is in fact that white dot on the canvas. And vice versa, if I were to have a white canvas with a black dot in the middle of it, the first thing my eyes would pay attention to is that black dot. So this is the last painting. As you see, I start off with my perspective grid very quickly. And just as before, I'm going to drop in some random shapes and some random colors. And the brush I'm using here is a combination of the different dry medium brushes that come as a default with Photoshop. The other brush set I use is the Adonis brush pack, which has been floating around for years now, and you can Google it, of course, and download it, but it's probably the most common brush pack that I use. Again, in saying that, brushes don't really matter that much. All they are at the end of the day are tools, but tools don't necessarily make you a good artist. Learning how to use those tools in your own way, of course, is the key to painting, drawing, or coming up with an idea and presenting it effectively. So using those colors that I laid down in the beginning, I start to create this composition for the image. And for each of these images, I really didn't have any idea what I was going to come up with at first. I really didn't have any idea where the paintings were going to go, or what I was going to do with them. Which is, again, it's kind of fun to be able to just start an image and not have any idea about where it's going to go or how it's going to end up, only to see it kind of come together before your very eyes, and it's all come from your own mind, it's all come from your own head. And I think that's amazing. It's an amazing part of the creative process when you're working this way. Now, of course, if you're working on a project such as Halo, or Mass Effect, or Bioshock, whatever it might be, they're going to have strict guidelines that you have to follow and stick to. So you can't be completely random with stuff like that. But of course, they're still paying for you for your creativity. So it's a bit of a balance when it comes to that sort of thing. So I'm just dropping in some foliage, some flowers. I really didn't have any reference for any of these images, so kind of had to just come up with it out of my head. But of course, having some reference there to go from really, really helps out. And to create these intricate details, the smaller the details, or the more refined the details are, the smaller the brush is that I'm using. So the bracket keys in your keyboard will allow you to adjust the brush size on the fly, and it's great to create those little details, such as the flowers and the grass there. So just remember that the more detailed that you want to go, the smaller your brush should be. So if you can remember those key elements, such as starting out, very big brush, working from a distance, just laying in the main composition, that's the first phase. The next phase is just adding in the details on top of what you already have there. And it doesn't require a lot of thinking. You've already used your mental energy to come up with the initial composition and idea. Now all it is just spending the time you need to spend, or the time you have left, to fill in details, put in a few extra brush strokes, to refine the image where it needs to be refined, and that's it. The other thing I would say is, if you're just starting out and you are learning the basic fundamentals, yes, it is important to learn those fundamentals, but also remember to relax when it comes to painting, because it is a creative process, and in order for your creativity to come through, you have to let yourself relax. You have to let yourself make mistakes. It's okay. It's easy enough to fix. It's not going to be your only painting, and in fact, every painting you do is going to be better than the last. So, keeping that in mind, all I could suggest is just keep on practicing more and more. Look up tutorial videos such as this one, or wherever you might find them, and there's plenty out there. The other key thing to remember is separating your foreground, middle ground, and background elements, and the way that you do that is you make typically the foreground elements a little darker in value, and as they go back into the distance they get lighter. And the other thing that will help you to do this is by introducing environmental fog using the airbrush, which is what has helped me create that depth within the image, or the illusion of depth within the image. But of course, practice is the main thing. Do 100 of these paintings and I guarantee that the 100th painting that you do will be a lot better than the first painting you did. It's all about the mileage that you have behind you, and there's other artists out there who are just working on this stuff 16 hours a day. They don't really have a social life, and they're just plowing through it. And if you want to keep up with them, or try to at least keep up, make sure that you set aside some time during your day to work on this stuff. Even a little bit is better than nothing. So again, adjusting the contrast there through the curves. Increasing the saturation as well to bring out those colors. And adding in a few more of the finer details. You can see that I'm zoomed in a little bit more now. That's basically it. I hope you guys found this tutorial useful, and I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching.